The only sound in the office that morning was the click of Morgan Langston's thermos setting down beside his keyboard. Same place it had landed for the past 2,814 days. Same chair, same angle, same goddamn loyalty that nobody seemed to notice unless the lights flickered or a fire broke out. He wasn't flashy. He didn't parade numbers in Slack or post about closing loops on LinkedIn. He just got the job done. Quietly, perfectly, and in total contrast to the circus of self-congratulation that had taken over Argon Edge in the last 2 years. Morgan's desk was a shrine to order. Precisely 3 pens, a worn legal pad with chicken scratch shorthand no one else could decipher, and a laminated contact sheet with only one name highlighted in blue. That name? Gerald K. Monroe, General Counsel of Eastwell Aerospace Systems. Argon Edge's biggest client and the kind of man who still answered the phone on the first ring and ended calls with much obliged. The relationship wasn't a company-to-company handshake. It was personal, legal, and deliberately exclusive. Gerald didn't trust many, and certainly not firms. But he trusted Morgan, had for years. In fact, buried in a 3-inch contract file that nobody had touched since 2017, there sat a clause, 12.3c, which explicitly named Morgan as the only authorized liaison permitted under their export control aligned subcontract. Not the department, not the title. Morgan, by name. And not one person in leadership had ever asked why, because why would they? As long as invoices got paid and quarterly metrics looked pretty, who cared how the sausage got made? If you're enjoying this story so far and want more like it, take 2 seconds to hit that subscribe button and like the video. Seriously, it keeps this whole thing going, and 97% of listeners never subscribe even when they binge the stories. It really helps the team keep telling these. Morgan never flexed that clause, never needed to. His power was in being unimpressive, the kind of guy who blended in at networking events and always remembered how you took your coffee. He kept client calls short, action items clear, and drama non-existent. While other teams at Argon Edge scrambled for attention, Morgan's world ran like a diesel engine at idle, steady, silent, and impossible to stop once in motion. I first noticed him when I shadowed a meeting in Q4 last year. He said maybe 7 words the whole hour. And yet, somehow, he was the one everybody deferred to without realizing it. It wasn't just that Gerald Monroe only took his calls. It was that Morgan knew why. They'd been through things together. Export crises, vendor blackouts. That time, a DoD clause was misfiled and nearly triggered a breach. Morgan fixed it before leadership even noticed. No fire drill, no all-hands memo. Just a discreet email to legal and a corrected version in the folder by morning. Rick Dolan, on the other hand, wouldn't have known clause 12.3c if it bit him in the ass and called him daddy. But Rick was daddy to a freshly degreed, aggressively self-branded junior strategist named Sydney. Sydney, who once posted on LinkedIn that she elevated vendor narratives into revenue-forward solution matrices after scheduling a coffee with the IT director. She didn't know what Morgan did. Hell, I'm not sure she even knew what Argon Edge did. But her father, Rick, did. Or at least he pretended to. And lately, Rick had been circling Morgan's department like a vulture with a Wi-Fi password, floating ideas, asking who really owns the client relationships, and dropping phrases like succession planning into casual hallway chatter. That's when Morgan started showing up even earlier, staying even later. He didn't complain, didn't document things. He just watched. I asked him once, during a late evening when we both stayed past 8, if he was worried. About what? He asked without looking up from his legal pad. About the noise. About Rick. He uncapped his thermos, sipped once, then said with a quiet chuckle, "Noise doesn't bother me, but unread contracts? Now that's what keeps me up at night." He wasn't joking, not even a little. The first time Sydney Dolan walked into the strategy bullpen, she was wearing heels too sharp for the carpet and confidence too loud for the room. She strolled in like she was auditioning for a commercial, all teeth and startup energy, swinging a Louis Vuitton laptop bag that probably cost more than Morgan's entire wardrobe. Her LinkedIn bio had changed 3 times that week alone. Monday, future COO. Wednesday, client strategist, building bridges and breaking ceilings. By Friday, she was client whisperer, federal channel evangelist, subcontract integration Sherpa. Morgan didn't flinch, didn't roll his eyes, just swiveled in his chair, uncapped his pen, and kept writing as if nothing had changed. Because technically, it hadn't. Yet. Rick showed up 20 minutes later, half-buttoned collar and the kind of smirk that comes from knowing nobody in the room can fire your kid. He clapped Sydney on the shoulder like she'd just won a congressional medal and announced without preamble, "This is the new era of Argonne Edge strategy. Sydney's gonna shadow the old process and help us reimagine it for next-gen growth. Morgan, buddy, you good showing her around today?" The air tightened. You could feel every glance flicker in Morgan's direction like a live wire just got exposed. He didn't look up. Then he calmly set his pen down, closed the manila folder in front of him, and stood up with the same slow steadiness he used when fixing a jammed printer or realigning a project calendar. He didn't say yes. Morgan rarely wasted words on the obvious. He simply gestured to the empty chair beside his desk and said, "You might want to take notes." Sydney scoffed. Actually scoffed, and tapped her tablet with nails that clicked like tiny threats. "I mostly record everything," she said. "Way easier to transcribe later. Plus, I've got a system. Color-coded workflows. KPI overlays." Morgan said nothing, just turned his screen slightly so she could see the dashboard for the Eastwell Aerospace account. No colors, no overlays, just a matrix of touch points, regulatory flags, and a contact cadence that hadn't shifted by more than 4 hours in 5 years. To Sydney, it looked like gibberish. To anyone who knew how precarious federal adjacency could be, it was a masterpiece. I watched the whole thing unfold from the far desk. Watched as Morgan guided her through the basics, never once condescending, never once biting, but never once pretending this was normal either. He walked her through audit histories, reminder protocols, contract nuances, all things she barely skimmed before pivoting to her client refresh strategy slides with enthusiasm that smelled like PowerPoint breath. Rick showed up again just before lunch, peeking over Morgan's shoulder. "See? She's a natural," he said, too loud. "Whole new generation of clients coming up, want something more dynamic, relatable, you know." Morgan nodded once. "That'll be a transition." Rick chuckled. "She'll take it from here soon enough. Let you finally use that PTO, huh?" Morgan smiled, the kind of smile that could have passed for polite if you didn't know better. Then he opened a new tab and pulled up a shared drive folder titled Legacy Contracts, Restricted. He didn't open anything, just stared at the list of documents he knew nobody else had read in full. Clause 12.3c. Still sitting there, still glowing like a loaded gun in the drawer nobody checked. I saw the shift happen behind his eyes. Not anger, not even disappointment. Just a quiet withdrawal, like a pilot shutting down an engine mid-air because he already knew where they'd crash. Sydney, oblivious, was mid-rant about targeting agile procurement mindsets. Morgan just nodded again and underlined a date on his calendar. 3 weeks ago. That's when he'd filed the LLC paperwork. It happened on a Friday. Always on a Friday. That's when cowards make decisions. They wait until your week is done, your guard is down, and they can slither out for happy hour before the fallout hits. Morgan walked into the conference room with the same slow, unhurried stride he always had. Legal pad under one arm, thermos in the other. There were 5 people at the table. Rick, Sydney, someone from HR chewing her pen like it owed her rent, and 2 mid-level VPs pretending not to know what was coming. The blinds were tilted just enough to cast lines across the wall, like prison bars made of sunlight. Rick didn't even wait for Morgan to sit. "Let's keep this short," he said, smiling like he just won a game no one else knew they were playing. Effective immediately, Sydney will be taking full ownership of the Eastwell portfolio and your other key accounts. You've done great work, Morgan. Real legacy stuff, but it's time to modernize, shift into something more scalable. We appreciate everything you've built, but now it's time to pass the baton. Morgan paused just a second longer than necessary. Not to think. He'd already known. It was the pause you give someone when they're handing you your own obituary and expecting gratitude in return. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out his company-issued phone, matte black, one small crack near the charging port, and placed it face down on the table with a soft click. "You'll want to reset it," he said, almost like a favor. "Password's been cleared." Sydney blinked, caught off guard. Rick tilted his head. "Come on, Morgan. Don't be dramatic. You're still on the team." This is about expansion, not replacement. Besides, you've got that whole institutional memory thing going. Maybe help train up the next wave, yeah? Morgan nodded once. Then he turned, walked out without another word, and left the door open behind him, not as a courtesy, but like a final message. I'm not the one closing things around here. HR scribbled something. Probably emotional adjustment plan or some buzzword bullshit. Rick leaned back, smug, hands behind his head. He'll be fine. Guy's too boring to quit. Probably halfway through a Sudoku puzzle right now. Sydney, oblivious, was already asking how to set up a client intake Zoom for Eastwell. I was thinking we could hit them with some fresh branding, maybe a deck with more visuals, like vibe-forward touch points. Nobody told her Gerald Monroe didn't use Zoom, that he hated decks, that he once ended a vendor relationship over a single emoji in an email. Back at his desk, Morgan didn't rage type a goodbye email or storm out with a box of desk plants. He just stood there a moment, looking at the empty chair where Sydney had sat earlier in the week, tapping her nails like war drums. Then he opened his personal notebook, the one with no label, just scuffed leather and a fading corner. Inside, clipped to the second page, was a printout. State of Virginia. Articles of Organization, Langston Strategic Advisory, LLC effective date, 3 weeks prior. He closed it, tucked it back in his coat pocket, and walked out of the building for the last time as an employee. Nobody stopped him. Nobody even noticed. Saturday morning, Sydney was already in the office. She posted a boomerang of her latte with the caption, "Building bridges, even on weekends. Kasha Client Whisperer." Her hair was perfect, her nails freshly shellacked, and her smile still had that unearned gleam, the kind you only get before the world properly punches you in the throat. Rick strolled in around 10 with a bacon, egg, and smug sandwich, whistling like he'd just nailed a merger. "Anything from Eastwell?" he asked, mouthful. "Gerald get back to us yet?" Sydney, perched at Morgan's old desk like she was born there, flashed her tablet toward him. "Nada. I emailed twice yesterday, called 3 times. It's probably just weekend delay. These guys are old school. Bet he's fly fishing or something." "Right," Rick said, plopping into Morgan's chair like it owed him back pay. "And once he sees what we're offering, the refresh, the data overlays, your deck, he's gonna love it." She nodded. "I even dropped the new strategy slides into the email. Clean visuals, no jargon, just straight-up client-first messaging." What neither of them noticed was that the very lack of jargon, the oversimplification, the deck itself was already a death sentence. Gerald Monroe didn't do fresh. He did precise. He wanted control, clarity, and most of all, continuity. That's why Clause 12.3c existed. Because this wasn't some B2B churn and burn contract. This was federal adjacent. Aerospace tiered, bound to export restrictions, and worse, a reputation ecosystem so tightly wound that one deviation, one misstep, and the entire house of cards collapsed. By Sunday morning, Sydney had sent 2 more emails, the third, subject line, "Just touching base." Got a reply, 4 words. "This account is not transferable." No greeting, no signature, just a reply sent at 6:14 a.m., time-stamped from a secure Eastwell address. Sydney showed Rick like she'd discovered a bug in the system. "Look at this. Super vague, right? Probably just a formality. I think they're testing us, wanting to see how proactive we are." Rick scratched his chin. "Could be their way of pushing back. Old guard types hate change. Maybe they're bluffing. Stand your ground. Let's give them a few days to cool off." Sydney leaned back, proud of her composure. "Totally. Once I get them on a Zoom, I'll walk them through everything. They'll see what we're doing here." But Gerald wasn't bluffing. He didn't send smoke signals. He sent consequences. And while Sydney was planning a Q2 innovation pulse with her Canva slides and action verbs, the real pulse, the one that kept Argonne Edge's largest contract alive, had already flatlined. Somewhere, buried in Morgan's old files, was a PDF labeled Export Review Protocol, Langston Auth. Password protected, never opened by Rick, never even noticed by Sydney, because arrogance never checks the fine print. And ignorance? It just keeps hitting send. The quarterly review started like they always did. Too many pastries, lukewarm coffee, and people pretending not to hate each other in pressed shirts and hollow smiles. Rick was already in the boardroom early, chest puffed like a pigeon in mating season, cracking jokes with the CFO about finally putting some Gen Z fire into client strategy. Sydney was next to him, flipping through her iPad like it was a holy tablet. She'd color-coded her talking points, labeled the client Jerry M in her outline, smiled like she was about to win a pageant. The CEO, Mark Henley, walked in at 9:02, late but not apologetic. He looked exhausted, as usual, the kind of corporate tired you can't fix with sleep. "Let's get Gerald on," he said, tossing his phone on the table and hitting speaker. Everyone straightened their backs. Sydney adjusted her blouse. Rick winked at her. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked. "This is Monroe," came the voice, calm, gravelly, familiar to some and terrifying to others. "Gerald, Mark Henley here. Great to hear you. We've got the team assembled and—" Another voice cut in, sharper, cooler, and with none of the politeness they'd expected. "This is Alice Denton, General Counsel for Eastwell Aerospace. Gerald is present, but I'll be leading this call." Rick mouthed legal review to Sydney with a confused smirk. "Let's begin with this," Alice said, enunciating each word like she was reading a verdict. "The non-disclosure and liaison agreement governing our subcontract specifies one authorized point of contact, Morgan Langston. That clause was co-signed, notarized, and filed under export compliance as Clause 12.3c. The room started to shift, people leaning forward, glancing toward Rick, toward Sydney, toward the door, like maybe they could crawl out of this. Alice didn't pause. "Your recent reassignment of contact and strategic authority constitutes a direct breach of the agreement. As of this call, your access to our proprietary systems has been revoked. All interactions are ceased. The contract is terminated, effective immediately." The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It was loud in the way only shock can be. No one moved. Even the projector, still idling with Sydney's title slide, fresh touch points for legacy growth, felt like it was mocking them. Rick coughed, half laughing. "Wait, Alice, this is a misunderstanding. I think maybe if we—" Click. The line went dead. The screen stayed on. The silence turned into gravity. Mark Henley looked up, his face pale and waxy, like someone had just pulled his life insurance from under his chair. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. Sydney blinked at the screen like it had betrayed her. They didn't even read the deck. Rick opened his mouth, then shut it again. Nobody said Morgan's name. They didn't have to. It was sitting there in every corner of the room, in the dust on his empty desk, in the void inside the client folder they never thought to open. In the sentence, "The NDA is with Morgan Langston, personally." And for the first time, Rick looked small. Not just stupid, small, like a balloon someone had just popped with a signature. Sydney tried to speak again, but the only thing anyone heard was the faint hum of the projector and the dull ringing silence of a $250 million mistake. 5 minutes after the call ended, 5 minutes of pure, unblinking paralysis, Morgan Langston walked into the boardroom like he never left. No fanfare, no slow-motion hero entrance, just the steady tap of his shoes on the tile and that same thermos in his hand, steaming faintly like it hadn't missed a beat. He didn't ask to speak, didn't clear his throat, didn't so much as nod at the dozen people around the table now looking at him like a ghost had risen to deliver judgment. He simply set a soft leather folder onto the center of the table, then stepped back. Rick stared at it like it was ticking. Nobody moved. So Morgan opened it for them. First page, a printed resignation letter, dated, signed, effective immediately. Second page, articles of organization for Langston Strategic Advisory, LLC, filed 3 weeks prior. Registered, certified, notarized. State seal pressed into the margin like a quiet declaration of war. Third page, an email, printed in full color. At the top, the Eastwell Aerospace letterhead. Below it, the subject line, Point of Contact Authorization, Langston Strategic Advisory. In the body, one line, effective immediately, all communications will be directed through Morgan Langston Principal. Signed, Gerald K. Monroe, time-stamped. Attached, a scanned copy of the amended NDA, same clause, new firm, same name. Morgan said nothing. He didn't need to. Mark Henley, the CEO, was the first to sit back. His face had that look people get when they realize their parachute is sewn shut. Rick, on the other hand, looked like he was about to ask for his lawyer, his priest, and a shot of whiskey at the same time. Sydney said, barely above a whisper, "Wait, what is this?" Morgan finally spoke. "It's clarity." And that was it. No gloating, no dramatic monologue, just that one word, spoken with the calm of someone who had already built the bridge he knew they'd try to burn. He closed the folder gently, like it contained glass, then turned to leave. As he reached the door, Mark croaked out, "Morgan, did you know this would happen?" Morgan paused just long enough to say, "I knew someone would stop reading." And then he left. No box in hand, no backward glance, just a man who had already packed everything that mattered 3 weeks ago, sealed it in a file, and waited for them to hand him the match. Morgan took his lunch in the same booth he always did, corner table at Ella's Diner, 2 blocks down from Argonne Edge. The waitress, Trina, already had his turkey club started before he even sat. She smiled at him with that weary warmth of someone who'd watched him eat in near silence for 8 years straight. Today, though, his phone buzzed just as he unfolded his napkin. He answered it with a soft, "Morgan," then listened for a beat before his lips tugged into a rare smile. On the other end, Gerald Monroe, laughing like someone who just watched an idiot drop a champagne bottle before the toast. "They actually thought they could swap you out for a resume and a PowerPoint?" Gerald said between chuckles. "She called me Jerry, sent a pastel deck with stock photos of fighter jets. I nearly had a stroke." Morgan sipped his iced tea, calm as ever. "I figured they'd push eventually. I just didn't think they'd do it that recklessly." Gerald exhaled sharply, his tone sobering just a touch. "I meant what I wrote. We're offering you a standing retainer, Morgan. Not just to keep us steady, but to clean up the debris they just left behind. Your firm, your terms. Just keep the wheels from flying off." Morgan nodded, not realizing he did it. "Appreciated. I've got some ideas already." "Thought you might," Gerald said. "By the way, you're going to be getting some calls. Word's out." He wasn't lying. By the time Morgan paid his bill, 2 other vendors had left voicemails, both asking if he was taking on new clients post-Argonne Edge. One of them had been at risk of being absorbed by the firm just 6 months ago. Now they wanted to know if he could help reposition them for stable continuity in federal-facing channels. Translation. Rick lit a bonfire, and Morgan owned the last working extinguisher. Back at Argonne Edge, the mood was somewhere between funeral and free fall. HR was in crisis mode, trying to draft a statement they could issue internally without admitting the obvious. The word transition was suddenly everywhere, on whiteboards, emails, Slack channels. Nobody wanted to say collapse. Legal had called Rick in by 2 and out. Word leaked out that the general counsel demanded a timeline of when Rick had last reviewed the Eastwell contract. When he mumbled something about delegation, they asked for a list of documents he'd signed this quarter. Then they asked him to leave the room. Sydney had locked herself in a phone booth, headset on, voice trembling as she tried calling smaller accounts, the ones that were still answering. At 3:17 p.m., Morgan received a text from one of the senior compliance managers. "Mark wants to know if there's a chance you'll return." I said I doubted it. He didn't reply. At 4:00, his inbox pinged with an invitation to a private symposium in D.C., government contractors and advisory firms only. The subject line read, "Adapting to Instability, Lessons in Strategic Continuity." Morgan smiled, then tapped the screen to add it to his calendar. No gloating, no vindictive posts, no tell-all memoir, just clarity offered in quiet doses to the people who'd finally learned to listen. By Tuesday morning, the legal department at Argonne Edge looked like someone had detonated a stress grenade. Half the office was buried in binders and backup drives, the other half combing through DocuSign logs and archived printouts. The floor smelled like burnt toner and fear. Someone wheeled in a second printer around 9 a.m. It jammed within 10 minutes. Nobody laughed. They found clause 12.3c just before noon. It wasn't hidden. It was just dense. Written in the kind of dry, lawyer-approved language that made most eyes glaze over before they hit the second sub-bullet. But once you read it, really read it, there was no ambiguity. The undersigned Morgan Langston shall serve as the sole liaison and strategic authority on behalf of Argonne Edge Consulting for the duration of the Eastwell Aerospace Subcontract 247B. This clause shall be considered non-transferable, non-delegable, and irrevocable except by written consent from the client's general counsel. No alternate point of contact shall be recognized by Eastwell Aerospace without re-executed NDA terms and revalidation under export compliance standards. Signed, Morgan Langston. Co-signed, Gerald Monroe, witnessed and filed during a 2017 closed-door export control risk mitigation review. Clause 12.3c wasn't just about trust. It was about national-level operational continuity, compliance under federal restrictions, sanction liability. Morgan wasn't just the point of contact. He was, legally and procedurally, the contract's living key, and Rick Dolan had tried to replace him with his daughter, with Canva slides. When the news reached the executive suite, it came via a short email from legal titled simply, Clause Discovered, Urgent Discussion Required. Attached, a PDF of the clause highlighted in red with margin notes that looked like a horror film autopsy. Mark Henley, the CEO, called an emergency meeting. I want to know, he said, voice trembling more with rage than panic, who the hell signed off on this reassignment without reviewing the contract. Rick, red-faced and sweating through his collar, muttered something about HR approval and assumed transferability under standard NDA frameworks. Assumed? Mark thundered. Clause 12.3c is bolded. It's in the second paragraph. You didn't need a law degree, just basic literacy. Legal piped in quietly. Also, it's not just in the contract. It's in the compliance folder marked Do Not Reassign Without Legal Review. Mark spun toward HR. Did you check the file? The HR-led Donna, poor thing, looked like she wanted to crawl under the floor tiles. Rick said it was a soft transition, that no formal documentation was needed. We trusted his assessment. Sydney was nowhere to be found. Rick, flailing now, tried to shift the tone. Look, this was a misstep, obviously, but maybe we can negotiate a reinstatement. There's still time to negotiate, Mark barked. You don't negotiate a resurrection. You read what you're paid to read, and you don't hand $250 million in classified subcontract work to someone because they're your daughter. The room fell silent again. Legal broke it. Also, Eastwell filed a formal statement of breach with the Export Compliance Board. That breach is now part of our federal performance record. Translation: future government contracts gone. Reputation damaged. Oversight intensified. Rick tried one last gasp. I thought Morgan was just legacy admin support. Mark turned to him, eyes cold and empty. Morgan was the reason Eastwell worked with us. He was the contract. And just like that, the paper trail, the one they all ignored, skimmed, or pretended didn't matter, stood taller than any org chart in the building. Clause 12.3c didn't raise its voice. It just sat there, undeniable and deadly, like a fuse no one noticed until after the explosion. The ballroom buzzed with the usual low-level hum of ambition and caffeine. Dealmakers in tailored blazers, strategy leads juggling name badges and notepads, junior analysts trying not to sweat through their first real suits. It was the annual Federal Vendor Strategy Symposium in D.C., the one with the ice-cold air conditioning, the $700 lanyards, and the glassy-eyed panels on compliance trends no one actually followed. Morgan Langston walked in without fanfare. No entourage, no booth. Just a clean gray suit, a laminated badge clipped to his lapel, Langston Strategic Advisory, and the same quiet walk that once carried him through Argonne Edge's halls like a shadow with purpose. He didn't linger near the entrance, didn't wave to the old team. Not that he could have if he wanted. Argonne Edge's booth was dark. A half-assembled pop-up banner drooped against the side wall. The table was bare, save for a stack of flyers someone had accidentally left behind. On the top sheet, a tagline still clung to life in bold navy type. Innovating legacy, scaling the future. Morgan passed it without stopping. He made his way to a quieter section near the breakout stage where a young woman in a crisp blue blouse and trembling hands was flipping through a conference program like it held state secrets. Her badge read, Marissa, Junior Strategist, Halberton Integrated Systems. She looked up, eyes wide. "Excuse me, are you Morgan Langston?" Morgan nodded. Her shoulders sagged with visible relief. "I thought so. I read about what happened with Argonne Edge, Eastwell, Clause 12.3c, all of it." He gave her a neutral smile. "That's not really a story people tend to broadcast." She fidgeted. "I know, but in my circles it was, well, kind of a legend. You held a $250 million pipeline together with one clause and no noise. That's, honestly, kind of the dream." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "The dream is to be replaceable, to build something so good that it runs without you." She paused. "But they couldn't replace you." He glanced over his shoulder at the empty Argonne Edge booth. "No," he said, "but that wasn't the win. The win was knowing what they'd never bothered to learn." Marissa hesitated, then asked, "If you had to give someone like me, just starting out, one piece of advice, what would it be?" Morgan looked her straight in the eye. "Never sign something you haven't read, and never forget who they signed it with." She nodded slowly, like she was hearing it in stereo. A moment later, someone across the room called Morgan's name, a new client, a handshake waiting, the start of something else. He turned to leave, but as he passed the booth one last time, his eyes landed on a quote someone had scribbled in pen across the Argonne Edge banner, just barely visible in the right light. "Sometimes the foundation isn't dead weight, it's the only thing holding the structure up." Morgan didn't laugh, didn't smirk. He just walked on, steady and silent. Final line, "They called me dead weight. Turns out I was the anchor holding their biggest account in place."